We're good to go. Sure. Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the North Perth Council Composition and Ward Boundary Review Virtual Information Session. Just quickly, the focus of these sessions is to provide some awareness, some context, some information about the process that the municipality goes through in a council composition and ward boundary review. And we'll talk about some of the key considerations that we're trying to get feedback on. In addition to us providing some information, it's important that we listen and we learn about what the residents want, what they think is important to them as part of this review, so that we're able to relay that information to council. Important to note that in addition to this virtual session that we're having tonight, there's also going to be 2 in-person sessions next Wednesday at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. We'll provide some more details and information on those sessions at the end of tonight's presentation, as well as other ways to engage during this process. Very quickly, before we begin, I'm just going to introduce the consultant team who's working with the municipality, do a little bit of housekeeping just in terms of the virtual session tonight, and then we'll jump right into the presentation. So some quick introductions. My name is Jack Amendolia. I'm a managing partner at a firm called Watson & Associates based out of Mississauga. We do ward boundary reviews for municipalities all across Ontario, as well as a few across Canada as well. I'm joined tonight by Josh Valenti. He's a project coordinator, senior project coordinator at the firm. Been involved with this team on multiple ward boundary reviews over the last several years as well. And we couldn't do these without Dr. Robert Williams. We have had a long-standing relationship. We lost count, I think, on how many ward boundary reviews we've done together, but that rounds out the consultant team. If we move to the first slide really quickly, just some housekeeping. So tonight is a virtual session. We have some people that may join the Teams call as well. The municipality has a live feed going on YouTube. For those that are on the live feed on YouTube, we'll talk, like I said, at the end of tonight's presentation in terms of how you can ask questions and provide feedback that we're looking for. And for those who join the Teams call, we just ask that you keep yourself muted, video off for the duration of the call. There's a chat feature that you can use to ask questions. And then at the end of tonight's session, if there's anyone who wants to speak live, there's also a hand up feature that we can use to select you and if you have any questions that way. So hopefully there's lots of ways to get your feedback to us. So I'm going to pass things over to Bob in a minute to start us off on this presentation, but just a summary of some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So first off, I'm sure everyone is asking why would the municipality want to do a council composition and ward boundary review. So we'll talk about some of the reasons why North Perth is doing one, as well as why municipalities typically look at these things. We'll get into some of the legislative framework and the process that we use. Spoiler alert, when we talk about legislative framework, there's not a lot, which there's some pros and cons both ways, but Bob will get into those. We'll talk about what we've divided this review into 2 fairly distinct phases. So we'll talk about what those phases are and what we're trying to get out of this first phase. And then at the end, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we'll talk about the different ways that the public can get us their feedback, because while there's a numbers-based component to this process and this exercise, there's definitely an engagement and feedback component that helps the consultant team ultimately inform some of their decisions. And like I said, and relay those wishes back to your council. So at this point, I'm going to pass things over to Bob, and he'll get into some of the details we spoke about. Bob?
Thank you, Jack. The next slide has a rather provocative title, I suppose. What are we trying to figure out here? Why are we doing this? And the big question that we're trying to address is whether the present electoral structure in North Perth serves the citizens well. And we'll explain what that structure is and what some of the issues that may be part of that discussion. But we're basically taking an opportunity to review the structure, because as we'll see in a few minutes, that hasn't been done in a long time. The other part of that from this slide is whether the present electoral structure provides fair and effective representation. Again, two fairly important concepts that we will attempt to develop in this presentation and later on in phase 2. But the goal is to provide for a fair and effective system of representation for the residents of North Perth. And if that question suggests that there are some limitations, there are some weaknesses, some flaws, whatever they are, then the last line there suggests, should we be looking at some other alternative method of electing members of council that might in fact improve that goal of fair and effective representation. So we're going with the idea that you have a system that's been in place, but it's time to step back and say, is it still the right one? And what are the things that we might need to address in that discussion, in that review? That's why it is a council composition and ward boundary review. The next slide is basically the starting point in a physical or geographic sense. North Perth, as most longtime residents would know, is an amalgamation of 3 former municipalities, which had long independent histories as part of the county of Perth, but they were joined together through something called a ministerial order, effective January 1st, 1998. So the township of Wallace, the township of Elma, and the town of Listowel were joined together to create this new municipality. Those names are still found on the electoral map, and in fact, they're there on your municipal logo as well. But the question is whether those components are still an appropriate way to provide for representation. So in the next slide, we get a quick overview of that on a kind of a timeline, if you will. So the town of North Perth was established under a ministerial restructuring order. There had been a study involving the component municipalities in the county of Perth that led to an agreement among various groups of municipalities, ending up with 4 municipalities, each of which was created by amalgamating the existing ones. The governing structure in 1998 involved the mayor, elected at large, and that's a standard practice all across Ontario. And in 1998, there were to be 9 ward councillors. In other words, councillors elected in sections of the municipality. And at that time, they were distributed in the format we're showing there. 4 of them to one ward, 3 to another, and 2 in another. In addition, there was to be, as part of the county council representation, a deputy mayor, but that person was actually selected from among the 9 ward councillors. So in 1998, the 10-member council, a mayor, 9 ward councillors, one of them doing double duty. Fairly quickly, obviously 1999, the municipality decided to make a change, which is still in place today. The current structure was established where the mayor, as we've suggested, was part of it, had to be there. But the deputy mayor position was changed from being one of the ward councillors to a separately elected position, elected at large, as the term is, across the whole municipality. So that was an office that an individual needed to run to serve in, as opposed to the previous one, which is selected internally, and we'll talk about that in a moment. To keep the number at 10, which was part of that discussion, the number of ward councillors switched from 9 to 8 and were distributed in a slightly different way, 3, 3, and 2 instead of 4, 3, and 2. And one of those ward councillors was chosen as a 3rd representative on Perth County Council. In fact, we should have mentioned in that previous part of that slide in 1998, the county councillor was elected in the same way. It was one of the ward councillors. So here we are, aiming toward the election of 2026. By that time, it would have been about 25 years since that structure was established. And importantly, in the last 10 years, the population of the municipality has increased by 23%. That's a very significant change. And by 2021, there were 15,500 residents in North Perth, a different configuration than we saw at the beginning. So as we've suggested and hinted at, if you will, here you have a structure that's been in place for 25 years. I would venture to guess there's virtually no other part of the municipality's operation that has not been at least considered, if not changed, over those 25 years. So we're really saying it's time to step back and look at whether this structure is still the right one. So the next slide helps to frame that up because this is a process that needs to take place under provincial legislation. The Municipal Act 2001 is the place where we start to review possible changes. And it authorizes what is called a lower tier municipality, sometimes a local municipality, like North Perth, to do certain things about its governance structure. First of all, it can decide how big the council is. We've seen that it has been 10 members from the beginning, and in that change in 1999, the number was kept at 10. So one of the questions we need to look at is whether 10 is the right number. Then we look at how the other members of council are to be elected. The mayor is not part of that discussion. Every municipality must have a head of council, as the term is now, and that person must be elected at large. But the other 9 positions could be elected in a different way, and as the number could change, they could be elected in a different way. So we turn back to the Act to find out how that can happen. And then the other part of this legislation is that the municipality has the authority to divide or redivide the municipality into wards or dissolve the existing wards. So as we've suggested, North Perth has had 3 wards. They have been permanent since the beginning of the municipality. They could be part of a process of redividing the municipality, or they could be dissolved entirely and every member of council is elected at large. Getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but that's there under the legislation. Now, the other side of the slide points out something that Jack referred to earlier. You would think with all of these things that there'd be some standard practice, but the reality is there isn't. There is no schedule for this. It's one of the reasons why it hasn't been done for 25 years. There's no standardized process. And one of the things that Watson and Associates and I bring to this is a process that we've tried applied successfully in a number of municipalities. And that is what we're offering rather than something that the province has established. Nor does the province tell us exactly how a review should work. So as we point out here, each municipality must set its own terms of reference, its own parameters, what all to consider, what kinds of principles are going to drive it. And we're going to talk a bit about that as we go along. So the process we're following, the things we're considering in North Perth are part of a decision made by the previous council to begin this exercise. In addition, though, we're not working in a complete vacuum. A review is typically framed by established procedures and principles that are found in other municipalities. Other people have done this and we've helped them. So that becomes helpful for us to figure out the right way to go about this. And we are sensitive to the fact that in some of those cases, the decision has been appealed to what used to be called the Ontario Municipal Board, now called the Ontario Land Tribunal. And OLT decisions, OMB decisions, have been very important in helping to work out the process, the goals, and the right kind of outcome for fair and effective representation. And indeed, there are some judicial rulings that are also part of that, and we are aware of those as we move along. So then we will move on to describing phase one. Am I going to turn it back to Jack, or will I do that from here?
Still you, Bob. Last one.
Okay. All right. So phase one, Jack has alluded to the fact that it's a two-stage process. We've already done some research and data compilation. Josh is one of our key people there to help us work with information from both the municipality and in some cases the county to understand some of what we've just talked about. How did you get here? What were the considerations that went into that? What were the changes that went on? Gathering information for us to be able to understand the current system. We've also, and I was the primary lead on that, interviewed all the members of council, including the mayor and previous members of previous council and the current council, just to help us understand how this system works. Are there, again, possible flaws? Are there improvements? What's everybody happy with? Where can we go? And we've also talked to senior staff. Staff has been providing us with some helpful perspectives on governance issues. So part of the third circle there, the council composition review. We're going to concentrate at this point on some of those questions I've just alluded to. How many councillors? How is the deputy mayor elected? How is the county councillor chosen? How many ward councillors are there? How many wards are there? Those are questions that are part of a council composition review. And our goal is to come to council in early July to basically ask for some direction. Are we going to continue with a 3-ward system? Are we going to continue with a 10-member council? Are we going to make some other changes? We're not asking council necessarily to make binding decisions then, but as we'll see later on, some of the decisions could have a bearing on how phase 2 works, which is when we look at these 3 wards or maybe some other number and establish some boundaries for the election of councillors in the next election. Jack, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. So really to summarize, I think that was great. And, we have some context and some history about how the system was established, how long it's been, a little bit of data on how the population has changed and grown, and where we are to today's point in the process. Tonight, we're going to really focus on what Bob just spoke about. And I think there's really 4 main questions or 4 main considerations that we're going to talk about. So the first one Bob touched on is council size. So right now we have 8 ward councillors for a municipality of about 15,500 people, deputy mayor and mayor. Is that the right number? We don't know, but let's try to find out. The second thing we want to talk about is the deputy mayor, how the deputy mayor is elected, the role the deputy mayor plays on council. So we'll have some discussions around that. After that, sort of the third main question we want to discuss is the county councillor that Bob brought up. Right now, it's a position that is selected from within the area, local area councillors. So we'll talk about how it can be elected, how that office can be elected, and some of the pros and cons of doing it one way or doing it the other. The last thing we'll talk about tonight is the strengths and weaknesses of having asymmetrical wards. And Bob will do a great job. I won't waste everyone's time now getting into symmetrical and asymmetrical wards, but it's a big part of I think, of this discussion. And it's an important building block of what Bob just spoke about in terms of where we go with ward boundaries, what they look like, is 3 the right number? So we'll finish off today's conversation talking about that system. So I'll get the party started, so to speak, with talking about council size. So let's go back to the legislation, and Bob touched on this already. So when we look at the legislation, it says a couple of things. It says that the minimum size of council has to be 5, and that, as Bob said, one of those 5 has to be the head of council and has to be elected by a general vote. So mayor has to be elected by general vote. You have to have at least 4 other members of council. But that's pretty much where it stops in terms of the legislation. There's no reference to what the biggest size council you have, and it varies quite wildly, as we'll look at in a second. There's no guidelines. There's no reference to if population is X, council size must be Y or Z. No reference to appropriateness. Like I said, nothing related to population. When we look at the charts, we'll see that across Ontario, the number varies pretty wildly, and even within Perth County, we'll see the same thing, that there's no real relationship, so to speak, with regard to the number of councillors or the size of council and population. Important to note that we're going to spend a couple of minutes looking at numbers because there's, like I said, lack of guidance in the legislation. One thing we want to do is look at some of these comparables. But it's important for the public to be aware too that this is not simply a numbers exercise. I kind of want to go back to the point that Bob made in terms of the review process, in terms of research and understanding, as much as we can, where we're working, talking to council, understanding that in some areas, perhaps more urban, perhaps more geographically compact, perhaps different economies, where a smaller council could be viable because of those things. And even though population might be smaller, those other factors may need or cause for a larger council. So I just want everyone to be aware before we get into a big numbers discussion that it's not all about numbers and that we consider other factors as well. So when we look at, this is just a sampling of councils sort of sizes between 7 and 10. North Perth, your municipality being 10, and this includes the non-area, not just the local area councillors, but deputy mayors and mayors. So we see population of about 15,500. Size of council, as we said, is 10, results in about 1,500 people per councillor, and including mayor, deputy mayor. We see next on the list, Whitby, almost 140,000 people. One council, one less in terms of council size, and a population per council member of over 15,000. But again, thinking back about what I just spoke about, and we think about North Perth and Whitby, and take the population out of the equation, there's some unique aspects to both of those places that may result in those similar sized councils. Not to spend all day going through this list, but you can see that populations everywhere from Perth South at 3,700 all the way to Burlington at about 190,000. Same size councils, all 7. So it gives, I hope, a perspective to the public that, like we said a minute ago, there's no hard and fast rules here that we have to follow, but we can get a sense of where sort of North Perth fits in by looking at some other places across Ontario. When we look at specifically at Perth County, again, we see some similar variance. When we look at the table on the right-hand side, and that's presented as a bar chart on the bottom left as well, we can see that, from North Perth all the way down to Perth South, like I just mentioned, 15,000 down to 3,700. Councils vary between 7, 10, and 11 members. West Perth, about 6,000 population, less than North Perth, 1 council member additional. Stratford, double the population, 1 council member additional than North Perth. So again, main theme here is there's a variance, and there's different factors that play into why we have that variance across Ontario and across Perth County. Next thing I'm going to get into before passing things over back to Bob is the role of deputy mayor that we spoke about. So we talked between Bob and myself already tonight that the legislation regarding council composition, regarding ward boundary reviews, can be vague at best and not provide a lot of specific parameters or specific guidance. When we talk about the role of deputy mayor, it's even more vague than that. There's actually no specific reference in the Municipal Act to the office of deputy mayor. However, there's many councils across the province that do have deputy mayors. So there are models found, like I said, across Ontario that have councils that do have deputy mayors. A couple of things to note about, why a deputy mayor. So a couple of reasons why, and it does vary across the province, and there's probably some other reasons that we haven't included here. But in general, it's appointed by council to perform additional local responsibilities. So there may be multiple committees that the mayor cannot just be in multiple places or be able to do all of those things in terms of heading committees. So sometimes the deputy mayor can be responsible for chairing committee meetings or certain things, obviously acting in place of the mayor when the mayor's not there as well. In many places across Ontario, the role of deputy mayor, similar to North Perth, and Bob spoke about this in the history and context earlier, is a representative on the upper tier council. So that's been a pretty common model across Ontario. And like I said, that's what's used here in North Perth. And like we talked about, the office of deputy mayor can be elected at large, and or it can be appointed within the elected councillors. And so in your current governance structure, you've had both. Like Bob said, when the initial ministerial order was put in place, the deputy mayor was selected from within your area councillors. And then the year after, and we'll look at this in a second, that a change was made by council to change the way that the office was elected. So right now, the deputy mayor is elected at large. Right now, the deputy mayor also sits on your county council. And just to quickly review what Bob touched on and what I spoke about a couple of minutes ago. So again, just as a reminder, deputy mayor created as part of the ministerial order in 1998, originally selected by a vote of council. We call that an indirect method of election. When we go back to the legislation says that council can alter its structure by changing the method of election. So that's what your council did in 1999. They altered the council's composition, and instead of selecting the mayor from by a vote of council from one of the area councillors, it was changed to an office that was elected by a general vote of the entire population. As Bob noted, your council size stayed exactly the same. However, Listwell, the ward of Listwell, went from 4 councillors to 3 councillors. And that'll be important when Bob talks about some of the symmetry and asymmetry in your wards and some of the representation by population. So I'm going to turn things back over to Bob. He's going to walk you through those last 2 composition components. Bob?
Okay, get unmuted and away I go. The county councillor question is not one that people have perhaps given much thought to, but as we started to do some work on North Perth, its history, and the other practices around not only the county but other places in Ontario, there were some interesting questions that I felt needed to be raised, and this is the place to do it. As we've said several times, the county councillor is one of the ward councillors. In other words, there are 8 ward councillors. One of those individuals serves as a county councillor, as opposed to, as we've just said, the current arrangement for the deputy mayor, where that is a separate office. On a ballot, you would get a vote for deputy mayor, but you do not get a vote for county council. And that's what we're going to talk about in a moment. How is the county councillor elected? It is an indirect method, elected by and from council. Those are the only people who could serve as a county councillor, as the 3rd representative of North Perth on county council. So it's not an identifiable office during an election. If you are voting for ward councillors in your ward, one of those people could become a county councillor, but you don't know that at the time of the election because this choice takes place later. There is a possibility, just as we could, if you will, look at the deputy mayor, it is possible that this position could be the subject of a direct election. You could have on the ballot head of council, deputy mayor, county councillor, and then ward councillors. And that would be, as I said, a separate component of the municipal council. And what was interesting to me when I went back through materials leading up to the amalgamation, there was a suggestion that, and I've quoted it here in that box, one of the models for reform in Perth County discussed way back in 1996 included a proposal that North and East Perth elect at large a mayor and 2 county councilors. In other words, one of those might be the deputy mayor, but the point was there were going to be 3 at-large elections offices filled directly. Now that didn't make it into the final cut, but it was intriguing to me that that idea had been raised, and part of what we're going to be dealing with here is, should it be reconsidered? Should that now become part of that equation, if you will? Assuming, well, it's for the moment, we've got 10 parts. Should that be one of the identifiable parts of the council? Leave aside, you may want to change it from 10. Okay, and in terms of that, the next slide touches a bit on that. What would be the point? First of all, council does have the authority to make that change. If there was a appetite to create a county councilor position at large, that is possible under Section 217 of the Municipal Act. And why would that be done? I've offered some points here that appear, by the way, in more detail in one of the documents that is on the website. But there's 4 points. Consistency. Okay, you've got 2 people on county council elected at large, but not the third one. Should they all be elected at large? In other words, the offices are consistent with one another. That's one consideration. Eligibility is another one. As we've alluded to before, if you wish to be the head of council, if you wish to be the deputy mayor, any resident, any elector in North Perth can submit a nomination and run for that job. To be a county councillor, however, the only people who can do it are the 8 ward councillors. So your pool of talent, if you will, is limited to the people who've already been elected. The accountability factor comes back to what I suggested a few moments ago. The county councillor, it's unlikely that the county councillor would be evaluated by electors on the basis of her or his performance on county council. They're really only accountable to their other members of council. Again, you've got 2 offices that are accountable to everyone. Here's one that doesn't have that. And then the last one is to do with, what does the job really entail? Clearly, the deputy mayor and the mayor are seen to be performing roles that are quite different than a ward councillor. Their mandate is to represent the entire municipality. And to get elected, they need to appeal to the entire municipality. The county councillor doesn't. Should there be, or is there a sense rather that this is an important enough job that it should have the same kind of parameters, if I can call it that? Now, as we suggest in that central box there's really no conclusive evidence about this in terms of which is superior. It's a matter of thinking about the nature of this role as it fits in to the bigger question. And as the little icon there suggests, what do you think about that, North Perth? Nobody's thought about it in 25 years. Maybe it could be thought about. You may say it's fine the way it is, but at least think about it. How does that fit in? Is this the kind of system that makes sense in this part of the history of North Perth? Okay, let's move on quickly to the ward symmetry question. And this again is a piece that comes about when we look at how the municipality was created. First of all, the present composition of 8 can be changed. You don't have to have 8. You could have, as long as you've got enough to meet that threshold of 5, the number of ward councillors could vary. I don't think there's a lot of appetite for adding councillors, but that's still a possibility. So the question of 8 ward councillors should be considered whether there's any change in the way the deputy mayor is elected, or the county councillor is elected, or even the overall number. What are the wards intended to capture? And again, in the restructuring order, there were 2 models. In 2 of the municipalities, Perth East and Perth South, each ward elected the same number of councillors. That's what I call a symmetrical system. The wards elect the same number. North Perth and West Perth were asymmetrical. The wards elect a different number of councillors, and that on the face of it is again not a puzzle. It's something you step back and say, why do we do it that way? Why do some of the wards elect more than others? And the evidence that I've turned up suggests that this was based on a concept, and it sounds like a big terminology, proportional equality. It's not equal, but there's a proportion. And the example I give there is an area with 1/3 more people than another. Okay, that could have 3 seats and the other has 2. That's a form of proportional equality. When that was done in North Perth back in at the outset in 1998, there was a reasonable level of proportional equality. But as we saw already, 1 year later, one of those ward seats was taken away and turned into the deputy mayor position, and proportional equality has been compromised. So I call this a founding compromise for North Perth based on this proportionate share. Listowel, Wallace, and Elma were different sizes in population even then. And so Listowel got 4, Elma got 3, and Wallace got 2. Again, roughly proportional to the population of the day. And immediately that got turned around by pulling out one of those Listowel seats and creating the deputy mayor position. So the system itself then has this kind of mixture. Some wards elect more than others, and conversely, residents in those wards have a different impact on the final outcome. I'm going to turn things back, I think, to Jack at this point. Am I?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. Yeah, just to finish off Bob's talk on the asymmetrical and symmetrical and the proportional representation, just a couple of charts that I wanted to point out that highlight some of the things he just discussed. So if we look at the chart at the very top, 1998, when the change was made, what we're showing is, and just a note too, for 98 and 99, we're just using 1996 census population figures just for consistency for this analysis, being that it was prior to the 2001 census. So if we look at the 1998 table, like Bob mentioned, based on keeping those same 3 wards as the 3 former municipalities and using the 4-3-2 structure, pretty much all of them have, between 1,200 and 1,300 population per local area councillor. And when we look at the average for the town, it was about 1,300. So again, all 3 wards had this idea of proportional representation. But when we fast forward, like Bob said, just 1 year later, just by removing that additional area councillor from Listowel, all of a sudden, Listowel now, a councillor there has 20% more population per councillor than the average, whereas Elma about 90% and Wallace about 82% compared to the average. Fast forward to 2021, same structure, still the 3-3-2 local area councillors. But again, like Bob talked about earlier, the population has increased quite significantly, and most of that population has increased in the Listowel ward. So now when we look at this idea of councillor per population, in Listowel, each councillor represents roughly 3,100 people, so about 62% more than the municipal average. When we look at Elma, about 1,300 people per councillor, so about 70% of the municipal average, and in Wallace, about 55% of the municipal average at just over or just under 1,100 people per councillor. So again, we hope that this table illustrates what Bob was speaking about with regard to symmetrical, asymmetrical, and the resultant population numbers per councillor. So we're going to finish off tonight's presentation just with a
Sorry,
couple of points. Oh,
Sorry,
go ahead,
Jack,
Bob.
could I
Sorry.
just go back quickly to that last slide, just to add two things that I forgot to mention. One of the reasons why the wards take the form they do, and this idea of proportional equality, was to save having to move away from the historic boundaries of Listowel, Elma, and Wallace. So they are now perpetuated as wards, and originally it sounded like a great idea with the proportional equality, but the growth has now thrown that off, and you're now locked in, if you will, with those same boundaries. So if our goal is to get, as we come to here, to get to greater fairness, the idea that they have to work with those boundaries may have to change. The idea that you have to keep them drawn the way they are becomes one of the challenges of trying to achieve that idea of fair and equitable representation. Sorry, forgot to mention that earlier.
No, it's a good point, Bob. Thank you. Okay, so a couple of things to finish off tonight's presentation. One thing that we touched on a couple of times tonight, we have a process. We've looked at how we've done things in other places. There's case law, there's Supreme Court law, there's some legislative guidance. But as much as there's best practices and guiding principles, one thing we want to make clear as well is that, again, it's that point we talked about earlier. It's the research, it's the interviews, it's talking to staff, it's hopefully garnering feedback from the public, is that we recognize that each place we work in is unique. When we talk about North Perth, Bob just touched on it, right? There's three very historically recognized population centers. Those three places have very different size populations when we look at what's going on in the current environment. We talked about the concentrations of those populations, how Listowel has really grown and really changed and created some of that imbalance that we talk about. We talk about a place that has 3 county councillors, if you will, including the deputy mayor, and the county councillor. But like Bob talked about, 2 are elected at large, 1 is selected from council. And as we just finished discussing, asymmetrical wards. So we have quite a few unique characteristics. Some have been present in other places we work with. Some are unique to North Perth. So it's really balancing that process, that system that we have in place, like we said, with the unique characteristics that we find in this municipality. So how can we continue to engage? So obviously tonight is kind of our first time speaking to the public, albeit through a virtual session. But there's other ways that we'll get into how the public can get us questions, comments, or really anything that you want to relay to us. For the first phase, like we said, we're focusing on the council composition aspect. So some of the things that we think that you understood from watching tonight, but some of the things that we really want to hear about is that size of council. Is 10 still an appropriate number? Bigger, smaller? The issues we talked about, or not the issues, but the considerations with regard to deputy mayor, county councillor, their role, how they're elected. Is this way a good way? Do we feel comfortable with the status quo? Do we want to explore other ways? Symmetrical wards, status quo. And status quo is really applies to everything we talked about. We don't only want to hear from you if you think the system should be changed, but we want to hear from you if you think the system is working well. Because we always say, we talked with staff and are trying to get down to, is council maybe looking for 3 options or 2 options or 1 option? And my comment to that was there's always 2 options, right? If we provide an option for change, because the other option is always status quo. That's always a decision that's available to council. And it could be exactly what you think, that the system has worked well and it's great to review it, but maybe after all that, you come back to us and say, we like it just the way it is. How do you get this done? Obviously through the open houses. So if there's questions after tonight, feel free to ask them. I mentioned, and we'll look at this again in a second, that there's in-person open houses next week as well. Similar format. There'll be a presentation completed by Bob and myself, but we'll have some poster boards up. We'll have some maps of the current wards. So we'll have some opportunity to walk around. And if you're more comfortable asking questions or comments that way, we'll have every opportunity opportunity to do that next week. Bob touched on this a little bit. He mentioned the topical discussion paper. If you go to the municipality's website, there's and we'll look at the web address at the end of tonight's presentation, but there's a whole slew of materials there. There's a whiteboard video that kind of tries to explain in a fun way about sort of what the process is, and some of the things we talked about tonight, hopefully a little bit more, quicker and easier to understand if you only have a few minutes to kind of learn about what this process is. There's discussion papers, there's quizzes, there'll be, after tonight's session, there'll be surveys on there. So there's multiple ways to engage, in terms of whatever you feel comfortable with. If it's literally just sending an email and doing it that way, if it's, coming in and talking to your counselor or talking to the clerk, sorry, Lindsay, I don't know if you want people coming in talking to you about this, but any way that you feel comfortable engaging, I mean, we really want to hear from you. So we hope that we've given you multiple ways to do that. In terms of next steps, so obviously public consultation is going to continue, and we talked about that. So just to provide some final details, and this is all on the municipality's website as well, but May 7th, so next Wednesday at 2 p.m. is one session in the afternoon, as well as a 7 p.m. evening session. Both sessions are in the council chambers. So this is really, not to sound like a broken record, but it's important because it really does help inform our decisions to get this feedback. And if you can, participate in the open houses, that much better and that much more direct in terms of feedback. Ultimately, after these virtual engagement sessions and any other way that we hear feedback, it'll help us understand sort of what the public feels about the things that we spoke about to date. And like I said, it'll help us inform sort of the next stage of this, which is us providing some recommendations to council. And like Bob talked about, getting some direction from council on some of these things, because I think if you start to understand what we're getting at tonight, depending on obviously council size being a big one, if that number changes, if what Bob spoke about regarding symmetrical or asymmetrical wards, if a decision is made there, all of those things can determine ultimately how many wards we might recommend, or how many, or even if the existing 3, what those wards might look like. So that's really where we're trying to get to with the end of this consultation, is to get to a point where we can provide some recommendations, or maybe even a better word might be suggestions, to council, looking for some direction for them. And then assuming that we get some of that direction and everything goes well, we would embark on phase 2 with some of that direction to actually look at the existing wards and those boundaries. So I'm going to finish off tonight's presentation on the screen. First of all, I want to thank everyone for attending and giving us their attention tonight. And just on the screen, what I spoke about, if you look sort of near the bottom underlined, you see the municipality's website address, and with the appendage at the end, CCWBR, which would take you directly to the municipality's council composition and ward boundary review. And like we said, in the next day or two, there'll be a survey up there that you can take and provide some feedback as well. So I'm going to stop there. Bob, I don't know if you want any last words, or Lindsay, anything else to add?
Let me just say one other point. This is an exercise that's about how you're going to elect your council. But it's very clear that council itself is not driving this process. We've made it very clear to council that this is a process to be handled by the consultants. We need to work with staff from time to time, but we're trying to make sure that council itself is, if you will, listening rather than driving what's going to happen. They would like to hear from community, I'm sure, but this is not a process that could be seen as some kind of inside job, that we've got certain goals in mind about what the outcome should be. I think that as we pull this apart, we realized there were a lot of things to be taken into account, and council, it may impact some of them in terms of whether they are prepared to run again, how they would have to get reelected, things of that sort. But their role in that only comes at the very end. They do not write the report. They do not make the recommendations. They are not here to steer us toward any particular outcome. We're happy to hear from the community to help us get through that process. But this, I want to be very clear that this is not council's project in the sense that other things are. I'll stop there.
I think if I can just add that, you know, just to echo the comments that Jack made about the public consultation sessions, anyone who's tuning into the live stream tonight or maybe watching a recording of this after, a key part of this whole project is hearing from our residents. So I would just urge everyone to take the time to visit our website, ask questions, whether you want to reach out to me directly. My contact information is available on the website. Participate in our survey, attend any future consultation sessions, and just keep the conversation going. So just encouraging everyone to come out and give us that feedback. And thanks to Bob and Jack for a great presentation tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Bob. And thanks
Thank
for
you.
everyone's attention. Have a good night.
Thank you.